listen up. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast belong solely to the podcast participants, and not to any participant's employer, organization, committee, or other group or individual. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. You know, for fun. So lighten up and enjoy. Stomping Jen.
I have a mouthful of cookies.
I know you do. Always you have a mouthful of cookies. And I will point out you are eating the cookie that I made for you for Valentine's Day that says J in B, that's my government name, B, forever.
It's true.
The most romantic gift ever. But I digress. On this show, we are going to be talking to Molly Hatch. She is an artist who creates tableware, home goods, stationery, and gifts designed to make the familiar new again. Right?
Yes.
She describes this as being somewhere between whimsical and traditional, right? As where we feel at home. That's the aesthetic that she works in, right? And I'm honored that she's here with us. Let me tell you why. Her work and her designs.
You're doing the whole intro.
I'm doing a real intro here. Are found.
You didn't even start the music.
I'm just doing an intro.
All right.
Her designs and her work are found in places such as Target, Homegoods, Macy's. Okay? And they have been seen on the Great British Baking
That's
Show.
the most important part, I think.
And her work has been featured in museums and galleries.
Yes.
I am super excited. You know I love talking to artists, so I cannot wait to begin talking to Molly, which we will do after the music.
Great.
The Soft Serve Podcast. Creamy, delicious ideas without the creepy truck. Okay. Stomping Jen.
I think that was the longest intro you've ever done.
Yes. We have new intro music and
Yeah.
a new style of intro. I will be doing longer intros.
Alrighty.
Yes. But without further ado, let us say hello to Molly Hatch. Hi, Molly.
Hi.
Thank you
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. I know that was a lot, that intro.
It went on and on. And
Yes, sorry.
No, it's always good. It's good. I come with, pomp and circumstance here. It's
That's right.
Our listeners will know and attest to the fact that I do like to go on. So thank you for bearing with it. Now, oftentimes I don't do a great job at describing our guests. So we always like to start by saying, tell us whatever you want to about yourself. Who are you? Why are you here? Why are you talking to us?
Well, I'm here at the behest of Jen, but I'm excited to be here to introduce your listeners to me and what I do. Even though it's visual, we're going to do it through talking. So that's always exciting to explain yourself as an artist, a visual person. In words, but I'm an artist and designer. I live in Western Massachusetts in Florence, and I have been doing this mostly with the tableware focus and functional ceramic focus, making pots since I was in college. But I've always been an art-minded person, and my mother was a painter, my grandmother was a painter. My great-grandmother was a painter, so there's a long line of family artists, though I'm the first one to really make a living off of it in that long line of folks, and have my master's degree and have been a professor. And I ride the two two different parts of my career, which are one as a fine artist selling through the fine art market and galleries, and, as you mentioned, museums and galleries and art collectors. And then I have this brand that's self-named as Molly Hatch that sells through large retailers and boutique stores. And it's everything from tableware to homewares and gift. And then, sort of everything between greeting cards. I mean, you name it, I'm kind of got my hands in doing it. And I'd say the one thing that connects all of that is the fact that I love painting and drawing. So I'd say that at the core of everything that I do, painting and drawing and surface design in general is sort of the main focus of my work. And there's a little bit of a tongue in cheek. I have fun with what I do, and sometimes it's a little ironic, and sometimes it's more serious. But I'm here to have fun.
Well, thank you for that. And I have lots of questions for you kind of about your designs and your design aesthetic. But kind of where I want to start is when I was preparing for our conversation, I had to question myself, like, do I even know what ceramics is, right? And could you tell people what that is who might not know, who might have an idea about what it is?
Sure. I mean, a lot of people describe themselves as ceramists or ceramicists, or you'll hear people talk about being a studio potter or a potter. I describe myself as an artist designer because I'm working more commercially with my designs instead of making them all by hand. So I think there are lots of different categories that ceramics can kind of fall into, everything from fine art and sculpture to design and utility. And so I think it's just one more material out there. And so people who are committed to ceramics typically have some fondness for utility on some level. Like there's such a long history. It's like the oldest material that we can study because it lasts so long. Even though it's so fragile, it's one of the longest lasting and unchanging materials out there, which is really fascinating and exciting to be part of such a.
And it's clay, right? Ceramics is taking clay, right, and making stuff out of it.
Yep. Basically. And it can be as simple as going in your backyard if you're in a clay-rich area and digging it out of the ground and using it, or buying materials that are mined and preparing to a recipe and making it that way. But yeah, ceramics is kind of all-encompassing. And it's even used in like military applications, like armor and warheads and other things. So
I didn't know that.
It's like the hardest material you can get.
That is interesting. Do we, just as I'm curious, in New England where we live, are we in a clay-rich area?
Mm-hmm.
Could we go out?
Yep. In fact, there's an old brick factory in Maine called It's now the Watershed Center for the Arts, but factories made bricks around here, and Massachusetts and New England in general. We have a very red clay. It looks green. So even if you're like on the banks of the Connecticut and it's sort of slippery and slimy and it almost looks green. And that's usually a clay deposit it's clay is literally rotting rock. It's like little particles of rock that have broken down into even smaller particles. And so you're actually working with rock when you're rotten rock, if you will, when you're working with clay. But it's just tiny little particles suspended in water. So you can actually play around with clay that you find and dig out of the ground all through New England. I mean, there are different veins of different kinds of clay all throughout the world, but the white porcelain that we like to use and eat off of typically comes from veins of it in China and England. There's a long sordid history of ceramics being, at one point it was worth more than gold, porcelain was, because it was so rare. And it was only found in China, but then they found it in Europe and Germany in the 1700s, and that changed things a little bit. So the history of clay is, I feel like there should be a movie. I should like write a script. That's my next to be my next thing that I do.
That was fascinating.
Yeah,
I had no idea about anything you just said.
It sounds expansive and deep to me. Like there's a lot there.
If you want to read a book, or it's like a kind of a sordid tale too, The Alchemist, and I'm forgetting the author's name. It's a woman's name. It's all about there was like indentured servitude and people claiming to have the alchemy for gold and getting themselves out of trouble with Alexander the Great by coming up with porcelain to save their butt. And there was lots of like amazing adventures and espionage and all kinds of crazy stuff. The history of ceramics is fraught with all kinds of drama.
That's crazy.
Now, you have you mentioned this, you have an education in ceramics and drawing and an MBA, or not an MBA, a master's degree.
MFA. MFA, right?
MFA?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Stomping Jen is you're the one with the MBA.
That's right.
I'm getting confused.
That's right.
Why did you want to study ceramics and painting? What drove you to want to study these things in an academic setting?
Well, I think I went to art school. So I was in the top 10% of my graduating high school class. I was a smarty pants, I guess. And I exhausted the curriculum at my local high school and was able to take classes at Dartmouth College for free. I grew up in Vermont and it was not far from Dartmouth. And so I did a semester's worth throughout a year at Dartmouth of college credit. And I realized that I didn't want to go to a normal liberal arts school or an Ivy League school. I really wanted to study. It just sort of solidified my interest in art, but I knew that I wanted to get a good education academically, sort of liberal arts education. On top of that, I didn't want to just have a good art education. And often art schools are so focused on art that they sort of leave the history and sort of writing and other parts of it to the wayside. They tend to be a weaker component of the education you're getting. And so I applied to all these different schools like Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and RISD has a great program with Brown, and the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. They have a great program with Brown where you can take classes there. And then I found out that the Museum School and Tufts University have an exchange program as well. And I applied to a bunch of different art schools, and I also applied to like Smith College and a bunch of other schools. And the only school that gave me money to go was the Museum School in Boston. So it was like, oh, maybe I should go there.
Yeah. Go where it's less expensive. Yeah.
Right. The universe telling me, hey, over there is probably a good idea. So I did that for undergrad, and I got my degree from Tufts. Actually, it's not, the museum school wasn't accredited. And since then, Tufts University has purchased the school, and it's become the art school of Tufts University more officially, rather than just through like I had to apply to the museum school and then apply to Tufts to get in. And it was sort of a backdoor entry, if you will. And so when I left school, the museum school is weird. It's like you didn't have to declare a major. You had no requirements for classes except for a few academic ones. Like you had to take a certain amount of art history, and you had to follow through on a certain number of like English classes, and you had to take a certain number of academic classes at Tufts to get your degree. But and a certain number of studio credits every semester, but there was no attendance. There were no grades. You just showed up at the end of the semester and showed all the artwork you had made to a panel or committee of 6 or 7 people, like a few faculty and a few students. And they would give you what was called a portfolio review. And it was like a pass fail. And then you kind of got through this. So what it really did was train you as a studio artist. It trained you to want to go to class on your own, of your own volition, basically, and like not necessarily need the grades or the approval of the faculty to go. It was more about what got you there of your own interest to go. So that was really great, because when I left school, there's no one there like telling you to go to the studio and make work. You have to want to go on your own.
Was that hard for you as somebody who was an academic kind of high achiever and superstar, like coming into this, that lack of structure? Was that hard for you?
That first year was really hard, but then I dated a jazz musician. He was a guitarist, and he was amazing. And at getting into the studio and doing his own work, and practicing. And it was that discipline of practice, I think, that kind of kicked me into high gear on my own and made me want to sort of step up and realize that if I was going to do this, I had to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Also, he was like never home because he was always at gigs at night. So I was like, what else am I going to do but make work, right? So I worked and he played. And sometimes I'd go and listen to him play, or we'd go see shows together. But I think that figuring that out was a big key part of figuring like my own personal drive to make was really key. So I left school and worked for a potter in Vermont, Miranda Thomas, and I thought I wanted to be a studio potter. I sort of came to clay late in undergrad, and I was doing a lot of drawing and painting, and then I figured out I could do the drawing and painting on the clay that I was making, and it was like, oh my God, here it is. This is the perfect thing. And so I worked for the studio potter, working at the wheel 40 hours a week, throwing pots. And then I had a wheel in my kitchen, and I would make things on my own at home in the evening. And it was like, I don't know, probably 9 months in, I realized, oh my God, like I'm not built for, like, I'm already physically seeing damage on my body, and I'm only like 22. So I was like, how am I going to do this for the rest of my life? Like, I don't know if I can.
Damage from working with the clay?
Yeah, my wrists were going numb. I mean, you're sitting there working with pots. Like I was throwing 40 or 60 pots a day, mugs a day, and then finishing them all the way through. And it's so hard physically on your body. And I was so young that I knew, if I knew now, like,
yeah,
like 43, 42 or whatever I am, it's like, okay, yeah, like there was no chance in hell I was going to be able to follow through.
I think about the punishment we put our bodies through as younger people, like in our 20s, and that you found that challenging. I can only imagine how difficult that work is physically.
Yeah. And now, I realized I had to sort of step it up and get in shape. So I started running, and I started, doing a lot of yoga and things like that to try to help offset what was going on. Cause I was already showing signs of like carpal tunnel, even though I was only, 22. Yeah. So it was like, whoa, okay. What's it going to be like 20 years from now? But also I was realizing the repetition was super boring. Like I was getting myself in trouble in the evenings, like drinking a little too much and like partying a lot, and kind of, that first year out of college is a little rough anyway, but it was like, like if I'm already bored, like what am I going to be like 20 years from now again? Like, like I have other things that I need to think about, like repeating myself over and over isn't satisfying.
Setting
other things.
Yeah. Setting aside those challenges with working with the medium, was there anything that you found especially appealing about clay and like working with it as an artistic medium? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, I think it's the learning curve is high. Like it was clear to me that it was going to be a skill. There was like a clear progression of skill acquired over time. So in painting, it felt very like subjective. It wasn't like clear to me what the point, like I was like, okay, great. So you're putting this painting on the wall and people are going to look at it. And I just didn't know what I wanted to say quite yet. And I wasn't really sure. I hadn't really found my own voice artistically. And so I knew that drawing was something that everything could kind of tie back to no matter what I did. So I just got into the practice of drawing and sort of doing it without worrying about that conceptual part. And I think it was when I realized that I could do drawing and painting and put it in someone's hands, and it would become sort of a subversive way, or less precious, or at the very least, at the end of the day, you could use a mug, like forget what's on it. Like there's a function and a use for it and a place for it in the world as a functional sort of object. And at the very core of that, everyone knows how to relate to it. And so I think that's something that's carried over into my work for sure. And I think that that's really important. It's really hard to sort of get out of the way of the pretension and sort of academic hangovers that come with art and what you're supposed to know, you think you're supposed to know looking at it. And I think that clay was so grounding and humbling, and that putting my artwork there and taking it off the wall and actually literally putting it in someone's mouth was like really exciting.
Yeah. I have a theory about you. Can I share it with you?
Yes, I'm so excited.
I've been reading and thinking about you. And here's a theory I came up with. Stomping Jen. Now listen.
Yes, okay, I'm
All
ready.
Right. You mentioned to us already you come from a long line of painters. Your bio also mentions that I think one of your parents was a dairy farmer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here's my theory.
Okay.
Farmers work with the earth, right, to create life and food. Okay. A lot of your work uses clay, which comes from the earth as well. And you create these beautifully painted vessels to bring an ability to people to carry food, serve food to themselves. And you've connected that with painting. I think this somehow is some kind of unifying artistic theory that brings together the crafts of both of your parents.
That's so interesting for you to put it like that. I've never really thought about it in that particular way, but I think I've been dancing around that thinking for a long time. But you just said it better than I've ever said it. And thank you for that. If that's what I've been working on, shit, that's really beautiful.
And I thought I'm relieved that you find it beautiful, because I did too. I was really trying to think deeply about that, and that really stood out to me.
Let me explain why I think that's beautiful. Is because one of the biggest hardships in my parents, my parents got together when my mother was 19 at RISD as a painting student. Mm-hmm. And she totally fell in love with my dad. And he rejected a lot. He was a classic 70s, 60s and 70s hippie, back to the earth hippie who rejected his middle class upbringing for a back to the earth life. But he did it with a lot more purpose and interest in political interest and changing things, really. And so my mom knew by marrying my dad, even at 19, that she was signing up for a life of farming, and she was also rejecting her upper class upbringing for this sort of out of left field, back to the land decision. And so they became organic dairy farmers at a time when it was really not hip or cool or anything yet. It was still very much in its infancy. And then my mother was the Vermont Organic Farming Association president for 8 years. They were incredibly politically involved in getting legislature passed for certifications, and became led by example by going through the process of getting certified. And I mean, it's just really amazing. So my mom really set aside her passion for painting and in order to prioritize their farming life. But my mom is interesting because she helped me redefine my understanding of success as an artist, because while I have financial success and accolades and articles and interviews and whatever, I mean, museum collections, I honestly feel like in a lot of ways, the people who continue to have an art practice, regardless of the accolades and the financial rewards and the outside interest, and that they're really making the work because they need to and are compelled to, regardless of what the rest of the world's experience of that is so much more true studio art practice than I have this feedback loop, right? There's this positive reinforcement all the time.
Yeah.
There's a lot of negative as well, but there's plenty of positive reinforcement, especially with the paychecks that I receive to continue. And every time I question it, some big opportunity like I might be thinking, oh gosh, like I'm not sure I can do this anymore. And then, like some museum curator calls and is like, we'd really like a piece for blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, I guess it's another sign from the universe that I need to continue doing this.
Yeah.
But, my mom doesn't have that, but she's in her 60s and she's still drawing and painting because she needs to and wants to and finds immense pleasure in it. And I think, again, like my musician ex-boyfriend, the discipline and need to continue is such a driving force that it's sort of inspiring. And I hope that I still would want to make my work or some kind of work or some kind of creative practice outside of that positive reinforcement that I was talking about. And so to marry those two, and so for me, my dad never understood the art part. He was really frustrated by it, actually. And he's given her moments along the way of like, here's 3 years, go make your work. And I'll help you. He wanted her to commercialize it or monetize it. And it just never worked because she never really had enough time. It doesn't happen in 3 years. But she tried, and it's just like it's never been quite as successful as you would want it to be. And I think for me, seeing my dad gets it suddenly. He's watched me lecture about my work. He's sort of figured out he understands what a plate is, what a mug is, and he values those things. And so I think it was a way like you for me to put those two things together and say, see here, like
how does
you
that
can value. Yeah. I mean, but you just tied a bow around it in a way that I'm like, I need to quote you or something at some point because that was so good.
You heard it here on the Soft Serve podcast.
How does it feel to be lecturing and your dad sitting there in the audience listening to you?
Oh, more nerve-wracking than any. Like, if I can do this in front of, so we went to the Archie Bray, which is a ceramic residency program out in Montana that was really fun. We went for a month as a whole family. My dad just so happened to, long story short, he was there with us for a period of time. And I'm lecturing to this ceramic community. So it's sort of like preaching to the choir a little bit. Like you're talking, people understand your process. They already know about the history of the material. They're, well versed in art speak, and they kind of understand what you're talking about. And then there's my dad, who's there listening. And he had never heard me lecture. And I think it was the combination of my confidence, the broad history of what I'd been doing, the continuity of thinking through it all, and the like rapture of the audience, right? You have this like group of 150 people listening to your daughter, like, oh shit, maybe she does actually know what she's doing. And like, maybe there's something to this whole thing. And he really like listened and paid attention. And I think it was never going to happen if I like sat down and did the same lecture for my family in their living room. It wouldn't have had the same effect. And then hearing people ask questions or like, follow up afterwards was equally exciting and important for him. And so I think after that, he had a little more reverence and respect for what I was doing.
I see that as an incredibly brave thing to be able to do. Like, I don't think my surviving parent has ever heard this podcast. I've never really told him about it, because like it would make me nervous that he would listen to it or to be evaluated by my parent. So like, I think it's incredibly brave to like stand up in front of your parents and say that here I am as a fully formed professional and person in this world. And now you can sit there and listen to what I have to say. And I imagine as a parent, and I'm saying like, I imagine as a parent, that will be a thing I will hope I will look forward to. Like I just
likewise.
Yeah.
And I hope, I mean, my daughter is incredibly interested in art and making and designing, and has often said, I'm going to take over your business for you, or, things like that. And I'm like, gosh, I hope I haven't created too big shoes to fill.
Yeah.
Like too much pressure to follow in her own way and to do her own thing. Cause that would suck.
Yeah.
That would be I would hate that feeling.
Yeah.
But it's interesting you say that too, because I think like my dad told me when I was looking at schools, he actually they paid for the tuition. I got a 50% scholarship. They paid for the rest of the tuition. I had to pay for my room and board. I had to get a job, and I worked at Whole Foods in Boston, like paid the bills. So I could live there. But he said, you're not going to make any money. Like, this is a career where you're not going to make a living. I just want you to know that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like someone lighting the biggest fire under my ass to prove him wrong, and so I was like, well, damn, if I'm going to make a living at this, watch.
Yeah.
So I knew all along. And I think that was actually a major moment when he heard me lecture, to have him see that he was like, oh, she's doing it and she is paying the bills. And in fact, she's the breadwinner in her family at that time. I was. And well, oh, okay. Well, maybe she can make money at this. And it took me being, almost 40 for him to realize that maybe this was actually a career that was worth pursuing. But it was like vindicating and a moment of pride for sure.
That's beautiful. And I was thinking a few minutes ago, a little bit, when you were talking about the positive feedback reinforcement loop, like kind of in relation to creativity. And I had wanted to ask you, like, how do you step outside of that to kind of recenter yourself when it comes to your artistic spirit, and do you have any insight into that?
I think it's really challenging. I think you have professors who spend a lot of their time teaching art, who look at people like me and have said to me point blank, like, you're living the dream. And it's like, well, so what energy and time you spend, teaching or artists, the young artists that you're bringing up in your university environment, I'm spending, working on commissions for clients who ask for my work to match their couch. And that's fine and good. And it's like I think of everything as a collaboration, because it's not just my work. Like, it's very rare that I have the opportunity to make work for myself. Yeah. And when I do, it usually goes really well. Like, people respond to it and they're really excited about it. But then they make commissions off of it because it's not quite right for their living room or whatever.
Yeah.
So, it's funny because, like, a lot of the work that I make that's personal for the gallery that initially shown at like an art fair or in an exhibition at the gallery, that first time it gets seen, it's like well received and everything, but rarely does that stuff sell. Actually, it's usually commissions made off of that. It does sell, but it's not, it's amazing how much more sells when it's sort of related and people want this custom thing that they've had there's an inner designer in everyone and they want to sprinkle their little like bit on there. Yeah. And that's all fine and good, but it's like, okay, maybe I make 3 or 2 of those pieces a year and everything else is really, sort of grounded in, other. And so it's rare that I have an opportunity to try something new without any repercussion. So it's really important. This is where I like pitch for art funding to happen. And like, so glad that the NEA is like being reinstated by the Biden administration, because
let's just get this say.
Yeah. Without grants and like money that is without strings, usually there's some strings, but it's not necessarily conceptually tied. It's just pure, like carte blanche support. I wouldn't have had, like, I've gotten grants to go and be in a residency like at the Archie Bray, and I spent that time developing some ideas around new forms that I wouldn't have taken the time to do, and explore new ideas. I'm working on a grant funded project right now for a show in Philadelphia in the fall, and again, it's like there's so much funding for it that it's like, oh, you have a $5,000 material budget. Do you want to make molds? Do you want to buy gold? Do you want to, like, it's sort of like you get to do whatever. And there's no, like, you have to earn that back. It's, we're going to pay for it. And it's like, oh, what would I do with that? Okay. I have to, kind of think about it. And so it gives you this room to create without those other strings or responsibilities. And then inevitably that feeds into what you do get paid for by
Right.
clients or museums or whatever. And so
Yeah.
it's really important. But I think my mental approach of thinking about my work as a collaboration, whether it's design work or artwork being sold through the fine art market in my gallery in New York, it's like all of it is a collaboration. It's a collaboration with a marketplace. It's a collaboration with a museum. It's a collaboration with, Target, their customer and what their customer wants, or, whatever. So it's like me maintaining some kind of aspect or identity in that is the hardest part. So I think it's like being super, super clear about why I'm making things and what the point is and what it is about, understanding what it is about my work that makes it mine versus someone else's is the thing that is allowing me to maintain a strong sense of identity, even when I'm doing things across materials and categories.
Thinking about those things that make your work uniquely yours, like what the Molly Hatch aesthetic, like take us back kind of to the early years when that was beginning to develop. Like, how did that begin to emerge for you out of that pottery studio in Vermont? Like, how did you begin that transition into developing your own aesthetic?
I mean, I think it's a really slow thing, but I think it was really in graduate school, to be honest with you. I think figuring out that I needed to do drawings on pots, and that was a big moment for me and a motivator, realizing that was a thing that really got me into the studio and got me excited about making work. And that the surface part component was really important. And that I discovered in undergrad. And I really have one professor, Kathy King, who's now running the program at Harvard. Actually, she came in just out of graduate school herself and sort of had this like Betty Page hairdo and like tattoos and like biker boots. And she like busted into this like male dominated department and was like this lady, and I was like, wow, she is like 100% woman, hear me roar. And I was like so into it. And I was like, I want to, whatever she's got going on, I want some of that. And she's still a friend. And I think of her as like a watershed person, because she really just like kind of showed me some things that no one had really showed me about how to, do my drawings on my pots. She was doing a lot of narrative pottery. So I think it was in graduate school when I was really pushed by the department that I was in at the University of Colorado, where I got my master's degree, was really sculpturally focused and not functional pottery focused at all. And there was this constant question about why I was making things functional and not making them sculptural only. And I think I just had to assert myself so many times and really dig my heels in and say, this is so important to me because, and really figure out how to aesthetically assert that as well. So many times that it became my aesthetic was like, why pots are important. Like to the point where my graduate thesis show was framing functional pots. Like I put frames around them. So I was like, they're important, like a painting. See?
Were they pushing back on you making functional pieces for like some specific reason? Was it because pardon me, I don't know kind of the intellectual exchanges in that world? Was it not high-minded enough, or was it?
Right. I mean, I think that the academic thing is that like clay as a sculptural material is elevated when it's put into like the sculptural context, because sculpture is valued more than functional pottery in the fine art context. And that's like the fine art context is where you want to be, apparently. I don't and I was like, why can't plates be valued like paintings? They have been valued like paintings historically. Like at that time when porcelain was worth more than gold, people would have their portraits done on porcelain because it was like having your portrait done on gold. It was like, this insanely coveted, valued thing. And I was like, I don't understand why functional pots can't be viewed as valuable as a painting. And so I'm literally making plates that are paintings now.
I mean, you saw them, right?
I did. And I had a question about those. And So can you describe some of those large-scale installations for us? I mean, one of the ones I was reading about, is it the upcoming one that's 450 plates, or is that one you just completed?
So there's several large scale sort
Yeah.
of mural scale installations. The first one was done at the High Museum in Atlanta, and it's in their lobby. So you walk by it to go to the museum's coat check. And the beauty of ceramics is that it's not changed by light, and it's not changed by weather, and it's not changed. So you can put a painting, a ceramic painting in a light-filled lobby, and it's not going to fade or get ruined by the light.
Oh.
Where paintings will, fabric will, things deteriorate paintings deteriorate and have to be conserved over time.
Yeah.
Ceramics literally do not change. Like, they do not change. So I didn't realize this at the time when I was like setting out to do all this, but it's like, you're golden. Like, you have like the perfect material for it to be put somewhere that nothing else really can be, right? So, or not many other materials can be. So the High Museum piece is 456 plates. It's 3 stories tall, so 27 feet high and 17 feet wide. And I made it in my 350 square foot studio at home.
Wow.
I had to break it up into like 8 little sections and paint it each one and hope that they all went, because I don't have like a 3-story tall wall to like try it out before I installed it. So that was like a moment where I was like, I think as an artist, if you're not willing to take those risks of like, I remember saying, yeah, I can totally do this. And then I was like, can I do this? I just got the commission. Like, I don't really know what I'm doing. It's like you have to reinvent the wheel almost every time if you're going to push the edges of what you're doing at all. And it's like this constant, like, well, here we go.
Yeah, we're going to put the links to these different exhibitions in our show notes so people can click on those and they can look at them. There's one that really stood out to me, I think, and I dislike the color green, let me just confess to you, but there was one installation you did that looked like...
You are in a green room right now.
I know.
My color choice.
The studio is green, but there was this one, the one that stands out in my mind after kind of looking at all of the different ones you did was this one that looks like it's mostly like green or like teal colored plates. And it's absolutely beautiful. So like and
that's the one in Atlanta, right? With the flowers? It
might be, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I think my point is these installations they're epic. They look like you've been doing them an incredibly long time. Like, is this like an art form is this a form of expression you had been wanting to try? Is this something you'd always been thinking about? Or were you drawn into it, like just by a singular opportunity?
That scale was sort of an opportunist in me. But what I was up until that point, so I'd been making pots and asserting them as sort of paintings for a while. Starting after graduate school and starting really with my thesis exhibition and putting frames around functional pots, I realized that it would be really amazing if I could make an image come together with multiple plates or multiple pots. And I was still putting frames around them. And then I realized that I needed to figure out how to remove the frame and not have the frame be so point so hard at them needing to be seen that way. And it would be a little more contemporary feeling. And a little less crafty feeling if I was able to really have the imagery stand on its own on a grid or even off the grid, so I started exploring all those different aspects of what I was doing. And the High Museum curator, Sarah Schleining, at the time, the curator of decorative arts and design, she did a lot of really amazing things for that museum. She's now moved to Houston, I think, but she saw my work at multiple art fairs and really wanted to do some kind of substantial showing of the work and keep a few pieces, purchase a few pieces for the permanent collection at the High. And I think she was seeking out a young female ceramic artist or craft artist, and at the time, and so I actually on the risk that it wouldn't pay off, I paid to go down to Atlanta and go through the collections with her, out of pocket. Like I paid to go down and visit with her. And we walked through the museum and she's like, you could do some work in this space. And, here's our collections, and sort of walk through the museum and familiarize yourself, because she knew that I was looking at historic imagery and reinterpreting it and making, derivative work, if you will, of that historic imagery, and sort of recontextualizing it in a new way with these plate paintings. And she wanted me to reflect their permanent collections in some way, in a contemporary work. And that would be such a great service to the museum and their historic collections, but also, to add contemporary work that encourages people to look more to their permanent collections, maybe aspects of the collections that have been overlooked. And so then she's like, at the end of the, I.M. Pei did the architecture I believe it was I.M. Pei who did the architecture at the High Museum. I'd have to double check that. But the architect had designed this wall by the coat check that was huge, but there's a window opposite it, and then a reflecting pool the same size as it, and the wall, the window, and the reflection pool are all the same size. So you have this sort of wall that is reflected in the reflecting pool at night outside, and this window that's in and out. And it was like, she was like, or you could do something here. And I was like, are you insane? That's huge. I was like, what would I do there? And then I could not stop thinking about the opportunity to go big or go home, kind of. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I can totally do something there. And then, 6 years later, it's still installed there. It's become iconic of the museum. People think I'm from Atlanta. They're like, you're Atlanta's prize. I'm like, yeah, I'm from Vermont and Massachusetts.
That's funny.
But I did a huge service for the museum and pointing back at this weird little English ceramics collection that they had that I reflected. And it's become sort of a favorite piece of Atlanta. And so it's interesting to think that, I took a major leap there, and I was like, well, if you're really offering that huge mural size wall, I think I can. And then, boy, I'll tell you, did I send that postcard for that opening to my professors at the University of Colorado, and was like, look, there's plates in a museum and their paintings, and how do you like them apples? I did it. So, it's nothing like someone telling me I can't do something. I'm like, I think I'm going to go do that.
Yeah. That's right.
I was thinking a little bit about what you said before about when you started painting on pots, and that somehow began to spark what we think of as your kind of aesthetic, right? Is there something about painting on the 3D object itself in terms of the creative process that inspires something in you versus doing it on a piece of paper beforehand and saying, I'm going to slap that on a pot? Do you start fresh with the piece, as a blank slate, and say, see, I want to see what I can do with this mug or this plate or this cake stand, or how does that work when you're looking at this blank 3D object that you want to begin transforming with your aesthetic? Walk us through that a little bit.
Well, I started sort of with two different aspects of my process being sort of focused on the one-of-a-kind art objects that we've been talking a lot about, the plate paintings, if you will.
Yeah.
Or sort of one process, and then designing is a different process. So when I'm making a mug for reproduction for a factory to manufacture, ideally I'm sitting down and making a one-to-one prototype for the factory to copy. So if you can imagine you're in China and someone hands you a piece of paper with some like notes on it that have been translated from English to Chinese, most likely there's going to be some mistakes or misinterpretation, and like it's probably not going to go great the first time. But if you can hand someone an object and say, make that, it's pretty easy to kind of unpack. Or even if you hand it to them with a few of those translated notes, they at least have the like scale and placement and feel and size and like color and everything right in front of them. So I try really hard to make things by hand and then hand them off to be reproduced. More and more, I find myself drawing and painting on paper and understanding the object and the limitations of manufacturing and handing designs that are conceptual over. And they are typically capable of, I've got a couple factories that we're sort of good rapport with now, and they understand the aesthetic as well, I think, and they kind of understand what I'm doing. And so it's worked really pretty well to do that over time. However, it's always more successful and the pots are always better when I hand them a one-to-one prototype. And it's when I make something that's got a die cut shape or something that's a little bit different, it really goes so much better when I can hand them that pot. So a lot of people make the mistake of, other potters will come into my studio or visit with me or talk with me casually at a conference or something, and they'll be like, so how is it like not making things anymore? And I'm like, what? Like, I'm totally making things. I'm just not making everything I'm selling. There's a factory that's making them for me after I make the same way that you would make pots in your studio and hand them off. So it's an interesting misunderstanding about like what the process is in designing for industry, because it's really no different for me than making pots the way I was as a studio potter. Is just that every time I make a pot, it gets reproduced and thousands get made instead of me making the thousands. Right. I'm an idea factory rather than a personal factory making things over and over. And I try to find, like the best-selling pots have always been the ones that have a little bit of hand touch on them, or like some kind of, like maybe it's a hand-painted rim or the color is applied by hand or, something along those lines. So it's, anytime there's sort of that human contact with the pottery, still, even if it's not my contact, it still reads and adds value, I think, to the pot itself.
Thinking about evolving towards and being partly an idea factory, right? Like, when do you begin to make that transition to saying, I would like to put my designs on this other stuff, like bed sheets or like whatever wallpaper, like wherever we find your designs, like when does that start to come into play for you?
So for me, it was early on with Anthropologie. They sort of realized that I was doing, because I was able to do the drawings and paintings that I was doing on this ceramic work on paper as well. I was multifaceted in my ability to translate the aesthetic to paper, which meant to anything really. So I had to teach I joked for a long time, like the first 4 or 5 years I worked with Anthropologie, I was at the School of Anthropology and I was like getting my degree in a year or two, and I was going to like graduate and like move on. And it's exactly what happened. It just took, 10 years instead of 4 or 5. But for me with them, the like risk and reward, it was just such low risk for me to figure it out that, if we wanted to make matching tea towels, it was like an easy thing for me to think about and conceptualize, because it's still an object, right? Like, it's not like, I still approach everything like it's an object. I was taught to be a designer, like think about things 3-dimensionally. So even if it's clothing, I'm thinking about the fact that you're like, you've got a front and a back and a side, and it's not just like, we're not just going to like slap something on there. It's going to have to work
right,
sort of more holistically. And so I think that's the thing that has allowed me to be a little different than some other designers or surface designers out there who pattern slap. They call it pattern slapping, when you just like put something on something without really considering the full object, and the fact that you have, like, I'm known for beautiful bottoms of my pots, and like not all of them have it, but I think about an inside rim and an outside rim, or like a little detail on a handle. And those are things that just you wouldn't necessarily think of, and I think it really sets them apart.
Yeah, design is so fascinating. Early on, Steve Jobs, who I hope everybody knows was one of the early founders and designers in Apple, like he would insist that the insides of computers look aesthetically pleasing. And like the engineers and the people building the stuff would be like, who cares? Nobody's ever going to see inside of a computer. And he would be like, no, I know it won't look nice. I want it, like it's like this insistence on, I guess I'll just call it design integrity, like thinking about those elements. Do you have to have a facility with digital tools too, like digital design tools like Photoshop, Illustrator? Like, do those come into play in your work? Because I think maybe a lot of people wouldn't think that somebody who works in ceramics would have to use digital tools like that.
Well, I think like when I applied for graduate school, I applied with slides. Dates me. Like
PowerPoint slides, not Google slides.
No,
right?
No.
She means like slides.
Physical slides. When in a carousel.
Yeah. Oh, geez.
Yeah, I'm old.
Sorry for that additional opportunity to date you even further.
That's okay, because I think while I was there, actually, it switched over to DVDs or applications on CD and digital portfolios. And then, the genius of the internet, like you can upload it, you don't even have to mail a physical CD that could get scratched in the like you could actually just like put it up on the internet and like have a portfolio, like a submission in one place. Like I envy the kids who are applying now because it's so much easier. You put one portfolio up and you just hit send to all the different colleges and universities instead of like replicate. I mean, it cost me like hundreds of dollars to apply for school.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm digressing from the real point of this, which is that during that time, we also took like code, like an HTML code writing class and learning how to write, like make your own website, because, as an artist, you end up in an entrepreneur, you're like an entrepreneur, really. You have to know how to be a photographer, take your own photos, make your own website, use Photoshop to adjust the photos that you took so crappy because you're not a good photographer. So you're like trying to figure all of that out. So Photoshop was something that we kind of had to familiarize ourselves with in order to be able to resize photos for submissions to exhibitions or to send for catalogs, or like, constantly being asked for images of your work. You have to be able to resize them for what people need and understand how that works. So I had a very intimate understanding of Photoshop, but like for the wrong reasons.
Right. Yeah.
And I never learned Illustrator. I'm still like Illustrator illiterate. But I have figured out in design, because I've had to figure out my own catalogs and my own books of, work and things like that. But Photoshop, it's like, insanely amazing what you can do with it. So, but the beauty of it is that I think, and what translates and sort of, again, makes my work more unique than someone who does understand Illustrator or who was trained as an illustrator in college and knows how to digitally generate artwork, is that it is still generated by hand. And then I scan it and I adjust it, or I'll make it, into a repeat pattern, but only using like basic Photoshop tools.
Right.
And I might move things around or reconstruct things, but like generally speaking, I'm creating artwork on paper and then scanning those components in and making it into something that applies to other substrates. So sometimes I run into issues with factories that require Illustrator. There's usually a workaround or some way to figure it out. And it's kind of amazing what you can do with just something that simple. But again, like I say, like figuring out how to translate what I do on clay onto paper, and then figuring out how to retain that sort of feeling and look has been a big part of what's made it possible for me to continue doing other things aside from just ceramic.
Would you ever use something like a 3D printer or something like that? Have you ever thought about that?
I think that would be really interesting, but it's probably faster for me to just because I can make things out of clay.
Yep.
It's like, so, I mean, it's interesting though that you say that because I just sent off 2 prototypes that I made by hand and they're kind of like wonkety and like my handmade things to a mold company in Pennsylvania to fabricate good prototypes to make the mold, like, so they can actually like make the mold work off of my, like crappy sketch and like kind of like this, sending them an example of what I want, but like you make it better and then send me the mold. So I'll pay for them to fabricate, a better working prototype so that and these are castings for my fine artwork that I'm trying to work some more sculptural forms into, but I'm paying pretty dearly to have someone else do that because I'm not, I know where my limitations are. So
yeah.
But it's funny too. I should also say as a side note, like I think the one thing that's stopping me from becoming like a full-time professor at this point, or at least the last time I was applying for jobs, was that I did not have, I wasn't well versed in 3D printing, and that's something that's like pretty much essentially required of any 3-dimensional faculty these days.
Huh? Oh, wow. No kidding. Do you want to be a professor at some point? No. Okay.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be really. Yeah. I think there's a chapter in my life that I taught at RISD for a while. Yeah. And I've taught at Dartmouth College and local community college, and I've lectured at like hundreds of universities and things like that. But I love teaching, and that's like a part of what I do that I really, really enjoy. And I miss that aspect of it. It's always what I thought I would end up doing. But then I end up making more money off of selling my work. So I don't, the world had other things in mind. But I haven't put that idea down totally, no.
Cool.
At the top of your website, you have the words woman owned and proud. So I wanted to ask you what it means to you to be a smart, strong, and successful woman in the art and business world.
I think it's sort of tied in with some other things that have been an agenda for me. I think the fact that I've never had to borrow money. I think I borrowed money from my parents once to pay some taxes. I paid them back like within 6 months. And I've really never had to go to a bank for money to or get it. I've written grants for my fine artwork, but I rarely get them. But I really feel like it's a point of pride that I've kind of done this with very little. I've come from a privileged background, and my parents have given me support occasionally at times when it's been, and like $1,000, like a wheel or like $500. I'm not talking about like, a trust fund, or anything. But I think building this business on my own with predominantly women like you, Jen, taking care of some of the parts of my business, and all the subcontractors just so happen to be women. It's not something that I necessarily like pointedly set out to do, but it's just sort of what's happened. And I think it's because we're all supporting each other and these sort of creative businesses. And I'm so proud of the fact that we're all doing that. And so collectively and supportively of each other. It's really neat. I feel a lot of pride in that. I think some of it has to do with my dad not thinking that I could make it. And it's sort of like, well, here I am and I'm doing it. And I want people to know that it's a women-owned business and that they are supporting a woman. I feel like more and more, especially through the pandemic, some things have really come into sharp focus for me about priorities. And all along, one of the things that I've had a hard time with is putting down a hand-making career for a career with industry. And I have really come to understand industry as another tool for making a living or another tool for making your work more accessible and sort of almost democratizing it so that people can afford it, right? And making it more accessible. But one of the things about that is the sort of slave labor economy. Essentially, like we are, a lot of this is made in China or abroad in some capacity, and imported to the U.S. And every time I work with a company, I ask them some pretty tough questions about how they are auditing factories and what they feel like they're doing to maintain like an ethical, like, are they paying living wages in these factories? Are they, upholding local labor laws? Are they, like, this is really important to me that that I feel like if someone's answering me and they've never been asked that question before and they're not like, yes, or they're like, I'm going to look into that, like I can tell really quickly if someone's being honest with me or if they're being shady, right. Or if they just don't know and they're not willing to find out, or if they're like giving me a sort of a, what I think I want to, they think I want to hear as an answer. And I've learned a lot about the sort of industrial world of making. And I think, some of this is grounded in my parents' values. Obviously, they were like back to the earth hippies who wanted organic farming. So I was like, for me, I think what I've really been interested in is continuing the studio pottery tradition of the handmade aesthetic that I'm grounded in and was trained by. And to take that to some degree to those values and that sort of a lot of the motivation and integrity for making things by hand to the factory world. And that means trying to ethically source goods, right? Like whether it's a woman-owned factory or the materials are from a woman-owned, like a women-run business, or I'm keeping it within the US and paying a little extra, or I'm sourcing it as sustainably as possible. So it's like fair trade candles or organic cotton, and pushing the factories that I work with and the companies that I collaborate with to do that. And only in the last year, a year and a half, I've met a woman who runs this company called To the Market, which she was it's sort of a long story, but basically she was working for the McCain Foundation on human trafficking and sex workers internationally. And she really found that what she could do to stop this chain of labor source or sex trafficking and human trafficking from happening is embetterment through employment and like supporting the organizations and factories that were hiring women to get them out of those situations in order to be able to maintain a life for themselves outside of men.
Right.
Essentially, like keeping the money in with women meant that children were being fed and homes were being taken care of. Not to demonize men, but to just sort of say that for those women, it was really empowering to have a better labor situation. Mm-hmm. So she decided to come home and set up a business that connected industry or like retail in this country with a bunch of vetted factories that she knew were doing this work already internationally, and continue to do the work of auditing other factories and connecting people with ethical and sustainable sourcing. And so suddenly I can go to these factories that I work with, or these companies that I license my artwork to, and say, okay, well, I know that you've said that this isn't really possible for you, but it's like totally not true. And I can tell you, here is a resource for you to like go, like I've done my homework and I'm giving you a resource for it. And now you can't tell me that it's not possible to do this on some level. And even just asking that question or pushing them to do that has been sort of radical. And now it's sort of gotten to the point where I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it and show you that you can do it and that the customer wants it.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's undeniable. Mm-hmm. Like you have to do this. So I'm trying really hard to sort of be super realistic about rewriting the book on that, and shifting their understanding of what people value on the consumer end, because I think it's, for some reason, people feel like price is always going to be king. And I think for some people it will be. They'll choose the cheaper thing always. But I'll tell you, when I'm standing in Target and it's like, that is a fair trade glass and that is not, I'm going to go with the one that's fair trade certified.
Yeah.
Aesthetics aside, I'm probably just going to, because wherever you put your money, you're voting for that thing,
exactly.
right?
That's right.
So I want people to be really clear that maybe we're not 100% there yet, but we're working really, really hard to try to change this industry that's way behind the times on that.
That's great.
So it's a very long answer
No.
why I have women owned on the banner of my
Yeah.
website, but I think it's all tied into all of those values.
Yeah.
And it's a really blunt way of saying, hey, you found someone who cares about this.
Yeah. No, I liked seeing it there. You don't see that on a lot of websites.
No.
You know, I think it's a good thing to know for all the reasons Molly just told us about. So, do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I just, like, it always strikes me because Molly is the most business savvy artist I've ever met in my entire life. And I tell her that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We work with numbers. I mean, I help her with numbers and, she always gets it, like you always get it. So it's one of my things that I love about you.
Oh, they've changed how I think about where to put my energy.
Yeah.
Honestly. Really interesting to have a grip on that. And actually, I think Shopify's platform and their analytics has really helped me make some decisions too.
Yeah.
That way. Yeah.
So thinking about the times we find ourselves in now, has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted you as an artist?
It certainly has impacted my time.
Yeah.
I mean, your parents, I'm a parent.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it has brought into focus a bunch of things that I really want to, like the moral and ethical underpinnings of what I'm doing as a business have become more important. Not that they weren't important all along, but even more so. Like, it's just really like, why am I doing this? What's the end game? And it's just been a time of reflection, honestly, and a time to sort of regroup and think a little bit about how I want to progress with this business over time.
Yeah.
And it's also given me some room to think about priorities in my fine artwork too. Mm-hmm. I would love to be in more museums. When I'm in a museum, when my work's in a museum, it's for public consumption. Mm-hmm. And there's often not money tied to that. It's often a free museum or a museum that's, affordable, or they have programs for children or whatever it is. And that feels like a lot more of sort of true to my interests in marrying fine art with a functional, the sort my mom and dad represented in one. I've got to rewind whenever I get this recording and transcribe that because it was so good. But I think for me, it's been interesting to honestly, I feel like manifesting, maybe it's tacky, I don't know, or too new agey of me, but I really feel like you can talk things into existence and manifest what you put your energy. It's just sort of like when you focus on it, the world, you're putting it out there and people will respond to it. And it's like, whether you're noticing it or not noticing. I mean, it's like when you're pregnant and everyone's pregnant, you're like, everyone's pregnant. Why is everyone pregnant?
That's right.
I think it's so weird. And so it's like when you're thinking about moral and ethical interests, you're like, suddenly everyone needs that. And you're like, oh, wow, everyone's responding to this, or, I kind of been sort of saying to myself, wow, my relationship with my gallery is great, but I've been the one that's gotten all these museum commissions myself because I've developed rapport and relationships with the curators.
Right.
I'm like, gosh, I really should be working on that. And then I had traded with a friend of mine recently who's a glass artist. And she was like, I've been Zooming in front of your piece installed in my house. And all these curators have been like, ooh, who is that? What's that? And I literally got a call from the Renwick at the Smithsonian a week later. And now I'm talking with them tomororw about
it's amazing.
So it's like, you never know what.
Oh, that's so awesome.
So I think what it's done is sort of given me room to step back for a minute. And how often do we have an objective perspective on our lives and what our interests are? And I think there have been so many silver linings for me in all of this. And the time with my daughter has been a really big one.
That's awesome. All right, I'm gonna switch to some sillier questions. We're gonna let you off. We're gonna let you off the hook.
Okay.
So this isn't the silliest question, but I'm curious if you could quantify it. Like, how many pieces have you broken in your ceramics career? Like,
oh my God,
thousands. Yeah. And what do you do with them when they break? Do they go back into like the ceramics hopper or something? Like, can you reuse them?
Ceramics hopper.
Yeah.
This is actually, that's like there is a
thing.
stage where you can like recycle it and you can put it back into use. It's like super crazy. So, I mean, if it's been fired once or at all, you tend to throw it away, or you can use it for testing on later or something like that. But Kohler, I did a residency at the Kohler factory, which is like toilets and sinks. They have an artist residency program. And right out of undergrad, I was still pregnant with my daughter in 2009. I was there doing a residency in the program. And they told me they have a 60% loss rate.
Oh my God.
Means that 60% of what they make ends up in a dumpster.
Wow.
Outside of their building. Yeah. And then they like chop it up and use it for roads.
Oh.
Okay.
So cool.
That's
I
good.
was like, what? But 60% of what they make is a loss.
Crazy.
And I wonder if there's something unique about this art form too, and that we'll just call it a fact that things break and they're fragile. That's the medium. If it like somehow builds up your resiliency, because
it's humbling for sure.
Yeah, like because you always know like this thing could fall on the floor and shatter to a million pieces.
Yeah.
But you know what? You sit back down and you start over again.
And there's this other thing that kind of we talk about factor a lot in ceramic or in art. It's an arty word. It's a word used elsewhere too. But I love the idea of factor, and that's sort of when the process or the item, the object or the process itself is part of the process of creating. And that's the kiln, right? It's like when you put something, so I'm painting on these plates or I'm working, and I can kind of predict and pretty much control what I'm doing, except that I can't really, because I put it in a kiln and maybe it cracks. So I have to repaint that plate, or maybe, I would say like probably 10% of what I do ends up having to be replaced, like a plate needs to be replaced. Or if I'm really pushing the edges of a process or trying something new, I've definitely had pieces where I've had to make 50% of the plates again, because I'm trying to do weird things with the gold or something like that. But and it is so humbling, because you're like, I just put like 90 hours of work into that, and I'm literally just throwing this in the dumpster. I can't do anything with it. Unless you know someone who's a mosaic artist that I can hook up with sometime. Just let me know. But I think that the thing is that, I think it's one of the things that I had to educate my gallery about, like basically that when I paint these pieces, I paint 3 or 4 layers to make the color work, or I'm painting it again, putting it in the kiln, and then I fire it. And then I hope again, the next time I add gold or some metal layer to it, I have to fire it again. And so at each stage that it's like rife with opportunity for something to go wrong. And I think it is super humbling. And I think it's like things don't always come out the way you expect them to. And that's where the factor, it's like this beautiful thing that it's not all about you.
Right.
Like at the end of the day, it's the process, and you have to let go a certain expectation of it being exactly what you want it to be. And I'm not sure that other art materials have that luxury.
Yeah.
Like painter, you can always go back and work a painting. And I would be like one of those people that would work it to death, like you got to stop at some point, and you don't have to stop. But in ceramic, there's a point where you can't go back in and do anything anymore. You're stuck with whatever it is. And you kind of have to like sit with that and be okay with it. And I think that there's something about that in the material that's just so satisfying and like super frustrating all at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. What's the strangest thing somebody's asked you to make?
Oh my God. People come like just.
Has somebody asked, what I really want to ask you is, has anybody asked you to make an urn?
Oh, totally. One of my cousins had me, ash becomes glaze when you fire it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I had a cousin who had a beloved sort of husky dog,
Mm-hmm.
and she sent me some of her dog's ash to melt onto a bead so that she could wear the bead as a jewelry. It's pretty intense, but I did it.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, I'd say that's one of the like more intense requests. But like whenever people find out you're a potter or a designer, they're like, you know what you should do. And it's like, you're like right there.
Yeah. Just stop.
There.
That's great.
Because everyone has a designer in them. And I've definitely had people like say, you should make this crazy coffee thing, like, and you're like, oh, okay, what?
Yeah.
You should just take a ceramics class and go make that for yourself.
Yeah.
It's a genius idea. I'm not gonna do it.
How do you feel about the movie Ghost and the song Unchained Melody?
I love parodies on that. In fact, the most recent one was Bernie Sanders with his kittens. Yep. And that was like, I mean, it's like, that is a clip that's never gonna go away.
Yeah.
When that movie came out, apparently, like I'll never forget my professor saying that there was this like intense resurgence surge of interest in like extracurricular clay classes because it was like they were all gonna have this fantasy of their own like New York loft with a potter's wheel in the middle of it. And Patrick Swayze with his unbuttoned pants like approaching. But no, I think it was like a proud moment for ceramics in the media. And there's like a never ending meme that continues. I mean, it's like someone's got to come up with I mean, maybe it's me and my script about the, arcanum and the history of the sordid history of ceramics and porcelain. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah.
It's a great scene. I mean, it's, anyways,
iconic. Everyone knows it. It's like you can't unsee that once you've seen it.
So what should we be looking forward to from Molly Hatch? The person, the brand. What do we have to look forward to?
We have, believe it or not, done a hard left and partnered with an apparel company in the UK, and we have an apparel line launching this summer.
Oh, let's give you one of these.
Very exciting. And it was just one of those moments where it was a good cultural fit, and it was sort of the perfect brand to work with from a bunch of angles, including sustainability and ethical production and all that. So that's really exciting. And I have a huge exhibition that's Pew funded in the fall of 2021. I almost said 2011.
Yeah, I do that too.
I don't know why. That's an interesting Freudian slip. I do wish I was 10 years younger. That would be kind of interesting. But it's the Clay Studio in Philadelphia. For those of you who are clay people or Philly people, it's a big clay organization, nonprofit organization that's moving, and they've been a big part of my career all throughout. And I'm part of one of 3 artists who got a grant through the Clay Studio and the Pew Foundation. I think Pew, I don't know what the official title would be, but to make an exhibition for they have a grand reopening of opening of a new building in a new neighborhood, and it's kind of exciting. So I'm making a huge body of work for that, and there's a symposium and all kinds of fun stuff coming down the pipeline. But
that's awesome. I'm
posting lots of process images, and I hope people want apparel. I have a feeling everyone's going to need new clothes after the pandemic. I mean,
absolutely.
True story. True story.
And
but Jen, you just need to let me know when it comes out which of them you want, because I think you're going to look so good in all of
it.
Anything you want to tell us before we have 2 more questions we're going to ask you, and then we'll be done, I promise. But anything else you wanted to tell us?
No, I think I'm
that was a lot, and thank you. I learned so much. but these two questions we might learn more, right? Stomping
my
Jen.
gosh.
These are the best questions. We always save them for the last. So what do you like to do for fun when you're not, doing the Molly Hatch art and business stuff?
Well, my biggest pandemic hobby has been pretty boring, but it's been working out. It's kind of a few years ago, my daughter did Girls on the Run.
Oh yeah.
And I turned 40, and it was like this amazing program. She did it for a few years, and I was running with her, and I was so glad every time she wanted to walk. And I don't think I've always been an active person, and I was like, I can't even run a 5K with my like 8-year-old. So I stepped it up a little then, and 3 years later, I'm like feeling really great, but I just want to make sure that I'm like able to keep up with my kid who's about to be a teenager and like taller than me, I think. So I'm in trouble. Yep. But I'm also a telemark skier, and it's a big passion of my husband's and mine.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So we both spend our winters doing that. And I've been known to knit a few things and explore other crafts. I also tried doing some macrame during quarantine. I got kind of a slow start, but I'm interested in like exploring other things. I just don't have all the time in the world. But I also really love cooking a lot, and I think that's like the biggest secret about potters and people who make functional ware is that usually they like to eat like a lot. Like we really like to eat. Yeah. Like eating is just as much of a passion as making the things that you eat off of. So
that's awesome. All right, last question. And you can what?
He loves this question.
It's a great question.
He makes such a build up to it too.
No, and you can interpret.
Then he plays this awful music.
You can interpret this any way you want. What have you experienced that you cannot easily explain?
Here comes the music.
I feel like I should have been able to think about this beforehand.
I'm sorry. Some people say that.
Spring it on people.
I do think there's a lot of synchronicity in the world. I honestly feel like my career is unexplainable. Like I really think like every time I start to question any aspect of it and think, I gotta drop something's gotta give. I've got to figure out, the world puts another, like the Renwick. Like I literally was like, oh gosh, things aren't really going. And like the Smithsonian called. It's like, that's what? Crazy. Okay. Yeah. Like, all right. Like, I think that, but I think that also meeting my husband, I'd have to say is like, how on earth do we meet the person that's just I mean, like he and I have been together since we were 25. We're so great for each other. I'm so thankful for my partnership with him. His dad was a pottery collector and English. Like it couldn't and he came from like a Boston family. Like it was like, what?
Meant to be.
Like totally. Like
that's that synchronicity you were talking about.
Yeah. And I love murdery anything too. Like I'd have to say like I am like all the murder podcasts, all the true crime, anything. Too. Like I'm so like anytime anything slightly murdery comes out on Netflix, I'm like all up in it.
Do you listen to True Crime Garage by any chance?
No,
that's a great one.
There's so many.
Yeah, I know there are billions.
I think I secretly need to unpack. Like I just need to know why people do the crazy things they do.
That is such like a thing that people love.
Yeah.
I think it's because it's like, how do you ever get yourself into a position where you're going to like slash someone like that? Like what on earth would ever drive? Like, it's just so foreign.
I'm actually reading this book by a guy. It's a kind of a explanation about serial killers, and how he got into this is he was a movie producer of some kind or a television producer. And he realized he had been in like incredibly close proximity and these overlapping periods to these two like horrifying serial killers. Yeah. And it got him like really interested anyways. Like, and he was saying like, what is it about me that made me potentially get in their crosshairs? Like as a victim, he was like trying to like unpack it from that angle, which I thought was really interesting. Anyways.
Sorry, this isn't for me.
Yeah.
Oh, it's total. I'm like, let's go. Let's talk about it. I'm so excited.
Molly Hatch.
I think I deeply appreciate it. And might have to come back to you on the strange things thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody's welcome to come back with these questions.
Yes.
And if you guys want to chat up about murder, crime stuff.
I can tell already when we have dinner someday. So tell me about your favorite.
Yeah, absolutely. I can go on and on. First, I want to say, Molly Hatch, thank you for appearing on the Soft Serve podcast. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I learned a lot. And I enjoyed our conversation. So thanks for being here.
That was a two-way street. I now have a complete explanation for why I make work. So I think this was pretty productive for me as well.
Yeah, and all of our content is Creative Commons, so you can take that and you can do whatever you want with it. So Stomping Jen.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Once again, you were the anchor to my co-hosting.
Oh, I'm so glad to be of service.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here.
Okay.
To our fans, to our listeners, future fans. There may be listeners who are not yet fans.
That's
Stomping
right.
Jen.
We're gonna reel in the Molly Hatch fan club.
That's right.
Yeah.
I actually have one.
Yep.
Thank you for listening. Yes. If you haven't already, please subscribe, download our episodes, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That always helps. Yep. Share with a friend. That's important too.
That's right.
And finally, Stomping Jen, anything else?
We love you.
Who do we love?
Our listeners.
That's right.
And wear a mask and get vaccinated and all those things.
Yep. All of those things. So, without further ado, I'll just say thank you again to Molly. I'll say all those things you just said to our listeners, and we'll end on how we usually end, which is bye now.
Bye now.
This world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate. Those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility. That all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the sources, scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth. And that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love. I shall never cease to do what little I can to help the world advance along that road.